The Project Gutenberg eBook of Bismarck by James Wycliffe Headlam. Edited by Evelyn Abbott, M.A., Fellow of Balliol College, Oxford. Facta Ducis Vivent Oporogaque Gloria Rerum. Ovid in Livium 185. The hero's deeds and hard work fame shall live. Bismarck and the Foundation of the German Empire by James Wycliffe Headlam. Copyright 1899. Preface. The greater portion of the following pages were completed before the death of Prince Bismarck. I take this opportunity of apologizing to the publishers and the editors of the series for the unavoidable delay which has caused publication to be postponed for a year. During this period, 2 weeks have appeared to which some reference is necessary. The value of Bush's memoirs has been much exaggerated. Except for quite the last years of Bismarck's life, they contain little new information which is of any importance. Not only had a large portion of the book already been published in Bush's 2 earlier books, but many of the anecdotes,
Uranus, Nader,
and documents in those parts which were new had also been published elsewhere. Bismarck's own memoirs have a very different value, not so much because of the new facts which they record, but because of the light they throw on Bismarck's character and on the attitude he adopts towards men and political problems. With his letters and speeches, they will always remain the chief source for our knowledge of his inner life. The other authorities are so numerous that it is impossible here to enumerate even the more important. I must, however, express the gratitude which all students of Bismarck's career owe to Ernst Kohl. In his Bismarck Registen, he has collected and arranged the material so as infinitely to lighten the labors of all others who work in the same field. His Bismarck Jodbook is equally indispensable. Without this, it would be impossible for anyone living in England to use the innumerable letters, documents, and anecdotes which each year appear in German periodicals, of collections of dispatches written from Frankfurt, and those dealing with Bismarck's economic and financial policy. A full collection of Bismarck's correspondence is much wanted. There is now a good edition of the private letters, edited by Kohl, but no satisfactory collection of the political letters. For diplomatic history between 1860 and 1870, I have, of course, chiefly depended on Sybil. But those who are acquainted with the recent course of criticism in Germany will not be surprised if, while accepting his facts, I have sometimes ventured to differ from his conclusions. J.W.H. September 1899. Hour of Venus, 2020, Anno Domini, Sol 12 degrees Capricorn, Luna 17 degrees Aries, Dies Veneris, January 3rd, Eravoga, 7:08 a.m. 93. Contents, Preface, Contents, Illustrations, Chapters 1 through 17, Footnotes, Index. Birth and Parentage, Early Life, 1821 to 1847, The Revolution, 1847 to 1852, The German Problem, 1849 to 1852, Frankfurt, 1851 to 1857, St. Petersburg and Paris, 1858 to 1862, The Conflict, 1862 to 1863, Schleswig-Holstein, 1863 to 1864, the Treaty of Gastein, 1864 to 65, outbreak of the war with Austria, 65 to 66, conquest of Germany, 66, formation of the North German Confederation, 66 to 67, the outbreak of war with France, 67 to 70, the war with France and the foundation of the empire, 70 to 71, the new empire, 71 to 78, the Triple Alliance and economic reform, 78 to 87, retirement and death, 87 to 98. An index. This text, again, available on Gutenberg.org, Gutenberg.org, and you can look for it there, or Gutenberg and Bismarck. To find it, has a number of illustrations. The Bismarck front piece, his coat of arms, Schorhausen Church, Louise Wilhelmine von Bismarck, Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand von Bismarck, Bismarck's father, the previous was his mother, Bismarck in 1834, Schorhausen Castle, Bismarck in 1848, Princess Bismarck, Bismarck in 1860, General von Roon, Emperor William II, Emperor Francis Joseph Bismarck, from a painting by F. von Lenbach, General von Moltke, the capitulation of Sedan, from a painting by Anton von Werner, Bismarck and his dogs. Napoleon III and Bismarck, on the morning after the Battle of Sedan. King Wilhelm of Prussia proclaimed Emperor of Germany. Versailles, January 18, 1871. From a painting by Anton von Werner, Louis Adolphe Thiers, official residence of Bismarck in Berlin, the Congress of Berlin, from a painting by Anton von Werner, Friedrich Kiruhe, from a photograph by Schrumper and Company, Hamburg, Emperor Frederick, sarcophagus of Emperor Wilhelm I, Charlottenburg, Schweckenberge, where Bismarck's mausoleum will be erected. Map of Germany showing changes in 1870. Bismarck, Chapter 1. Birth and parentage. Otto Edward Leopold von Bismarck was born at the manor house of Schönhausen in the Mark of Brandenburg on April 1st, 1815, just a month before Napoleon had escaped from Elba, and as the child lay in his cradle, the peasants of the village, who but half a year ago had returned from the great campaign in France, were once more called to arms. A few months passed by. Again, the King of Prussia returned at the head of his army. In the village churches, the medals won at Waterloo were hung up by those of Grossbeeren and Leipzig. One more victory had been added to the Prussian flags, and then a profound peace fell upon Europe. 50 years were to go by before a Prussian army again marched out to meet a foreign foe. The name and family of Bismarck were among the oldest in the land. Many of the great Prussian statesmen have come from other countries. Stein was from Nassau, and Hardenberg was a subject of the Elector of Hanover. Even Blicher and Schwerin were Mecklenburgers, and the Moltkes belonged to Holstein. The Bismarcks are pure Brandenburgers. They belong to the old Mark. The district ruled over by Margraves, who were sent by the emperor to keep order on the northern frontier. They were there 200 years before the first Hohenzollern came to the north. The first of the name of whom we hear was Herbert von Bismarck, who in 1270 was master of the Guild of Clothiers in the city of Stendal. The town had been founded about 100 years before by Albert the Bear, and men had come in from the country around to enjoy the privileges and security of city life. Doubtless Herbert, or his father, had come from Bismarck, a village about 20 miles to the west, which takes its name either from the little stream, the Bies, which runs near it, or from the bishop in whose domain it lay. He was probably the first to bear the name, which would have no meaning so long as he remained in his native place. For the von was still a mark of origin, and had not yet become the sign of nobility. Other immigrants from Bismarck seem also to have assumed it. In the neighboring town of Prenzland, the name occurs, and it is still found among the peasants of the Mark, and the winds were driven back, and the German invasion spread. More adventurous colonists migrated beyond the Oder and founded a new Bismarck in Pomerania. Bismarck's coat of arms: 2 rampant eagles standing upright, both with a foot, seemingly the left or the right, upon a cube which has a maple leaf surrounded by 3 individual sprigs and topped with many other beautiful items, including what looks like the horns of an ox. In Trinitate Robert, in Trinitate Robur. Of the lineage of Herbert, we know nothing. His ancestors must have been among the colonists who had been planted by the emperors of the northern frontier to occupy the land conquered from the heathen. He seems himself to have been a man of substance and position. He already used the arms, the double trefoil, which are still borne by all the branches of his family. His descendants are often mentioned in the records of the guild. His son or grandson, Rudolf or Rude, represented the town in a conflict with the neighboring dukes of Brunswick. It was his son, Nicholas, or Klaus, as he is generally called, who founded the fortunes of the family. He attached himself closely to the cause of the Margraves, whom he supported in his troubles with the Duke of Brunswick, and whose interests he represented in the town council. He was amply rewarded for his fidelity after a quarrel between the city and the prince. Bismarck left his native home and permanently entered the service of the Margrave. Though probably hitherto only a simple citizen, he was enfeoffed with the castle of Bergstall, an important post, for it was situated on the borders of the Mark and the bishopric of Magdeburg. He was thereby admitted into the privileged class of Schulesgesindeten. Under the Margrave, the highest order in the feudal hierarchy. From that day, the Bismarcks have held their own among the nobility of Brandenburg. Klaus eventually became Hofmaster of Brandenburg, the chief officer at the court. He had his quarrels with the church, or rather with the spiritual lords, the bishops of Heidelberg and Magdeburg, and was once excommunicated, as his father had been before him, and as 2 of his sons were after him. Klaus died about the year 1385. For 200 years, the Bismarcks continued to live at Bergstall, to which they added many other estates. When Conrad of Hohenzollern was appointed Margrave and Elector, he found sturdy supporters in the lords of Bergstall. He and his successors often came there to hunt in the deer and wild boars, perhaps, also the wolves and bears, with which the forests around the castle abounded. Klaus died about the year 1385. For 200 years, the Bismarcks continued to live at Bergstall, to which they added many other estates. When Conrad of Hohenzollern was appointed Margrave and Elector, he found sturdy supporters in the lords of Bergstall. He and his successors often came there to hunt the deer and wild boars, perhaps also the wolves and bears, with which the forests around the castle abounded. For the Hohenzollerns were keen sportsmen, then as now, as their vassals found to their cost. In 1555, Hans George, son of the reigning elector Albert Achilles, bought the neighboring estate of Letzlingen from Olven Slebens. There he built a house which is still the chief hunting lodge of the kings of Prussia. Soon he cast envious eyes on the great woods and preserves which belonged to Bergstall, and intimated that he wished to possess them. The Bismarcks resisted long. First, they were compelled to surrender their hunting rights. This was not sufficient. The appetite of the prince grew. In his own words, he wished to be rid of the Bismarcks from the Moor and the Tangier altogether. He offered in exchange some of the monasteries which had lately been suppressed. The Bismarcks, the family was represented by two pairs of brothers who all lived together in the great castle, long refused. They represented that their ancestors had been faithful vassals. They had served the electors with blood and treasure. They wished to remain in the pleasant place to which they had been assigned by God Almighty. It was all of no use. The prince insisted, and his wrath was dangerous. The Bismarcks gave in. They surrendered Bergstall and received in exchange Schönhausen and Crivisse, a confiscated nunnery, on condition that as long as the ejected nuns lived in the new lords, the new lords should support them, for which purpose the Bismarcks had annually to supply a certain quantity of food and 18 barrels of beer. Of the 4 co-proprietors, all died without issue, except Frederick, called the permutator, in whose hands the whole of the family property was again collected. He went to live at Schönhausen.
Saturn rises.
Which since then has been the home of the family. No remains of the old castle exist, but the church, built in the 13th century, is one of the oldest and most beautiful in the land, between the Havel and the Elbe. House and church stand side by side on a small rising overlooking the Elbe. Here they took up their abode. The family to some extent had come down in the world. The change had been a disadvantageous one. They had lost in wealth and importance. For 200 years they played no very prominent part. They married with the neighboring country gentry and fought in all the wars. Rudolph, Frederick's son, fought in France in behalf of the Huguenots, and then under the emperor against the Turks. His grandson, August, enlisted under Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar. Afterwards, he fought in the religious wars in France and Germany, always on the Protestant side. Lastly, he took service under the Elector of Brandenburg. It was in his lifetime that a great change began to take place, which was to alter the whole of his life. It was in his lifetime that a great change began to take place, which was to alter the whole life of his descendants. In 1640, Frederick William, known as the Great Elector, succeeded his father. He it was who laid the foundations for that system of government by which a small German principality has grown to be the most powerful military monarchy in modern Europe. He held his own against the emperor. He fought with the Poles and compelled their king to grant him East Prussia. He drove the Swedes out of the land. More than this, he enforced order in his own dominions. He laid the foundation for the prosperity of Berlin. He organized the administration and got together a small but efficient military force. The growing power of the elector was gained to a great extent at the expense of the nobles. He took from them many of the privileges that had been enjoyed. They worked The work he began was continued by his son, who took the title of king, and by his grandson, who invented the Prussian system of administration, and created the army with which Frederick the Great fought his battles. The result of the growth of the strong, organized monarchy was indeed completely to alter the position of the nobles. The German barons in the south had succeeded in throwing off the control of their territorial lords. They owed no authority but the vague control of the distant emperor, and ruled their little estates with an almost royal independence. They had their own laws, their own coinage, their own army. An image of the Schorhausen church interior. It's about the size of a modern banquet hall from the image here, but with perspective, it could be quite larger. In the north, the nobles of Mecklenburg, Holstein, and Hanover formed a dominant class, and the whole government of the state was in their hands. But those barons whose homes fell within the dominion of the kings of Prussia found themselves face to face with a will and a power stronger than their own. They lost in independence, but they gained far more than they lost. They were the basis on which the state was built up. They no longer wasted their military prowess in purposeless feuds or in mercenary service. In the Prussian army and administration, they found full scope for their ambition. And when the victories of Frederick the Great had raised Prussia to the rank of a European power, the nobles of Brandenburg were the most loyal of his subjects. They formed an exclusive caste. They seldom left their homes. They were little known in the south of Germany or in the foreign countries. They seldom married outside their own ranks. Their chief amusement was the chase, and their chief occupation was war. And no king has ever had under his orders so fine a race of soldiers. They commanded the armies of Frederick and won his battles. Dearly did they pay for the greatness of Prussia. Of one family alone, the Kleist, 764 fell on the field of battle during the 7 Years' War. In the north, the nobles of Mecklenburg, Holstein, and Hanover formed a dominant class, and the whole government of the state was in their hands. But those barons whose homes fell within the dominion of the kings of Prussia found themselves face to face with a will and a power stronger than their own. They lost in independence, but they gained far more than they lost. They were the basis on which the state was built up. They no longer wasted their military prowess in purposeless feuds or in mercenary service. In the Prussian army and administration, they found full scope for their ambition. And when the victories of Frederick the Great had raised Prussia to the rank of a European power, the nobles of Brandenburg were the most loyal of his subjects. They formed an exclusive caste. They seldom left their homes. They were little known in the south of Germany or in foreign countries. They seldom married outside their rank. Their chief amusement was the chase, and their chief occupation was war. And no king has ever had under his orders so fine a race of soldiers. They commanded the armies of Frederick and won his battles. Dearly did they pay for the greatness of Prussia. Of one family alone, the Cleys, 74 fell on the field of battle during the 7 Years' War. They might well consider that the state which they had helped to make, and which they had saved by their blood, belonged to them. But if they had become Prussians, they did not cease to be Brandenburgers. Their loyalty to their king never swerved, for they knew that he belonged to them, and he did to no other of his. They knew that he belonged to them as he did to no other of his subjects. He might go to distant Königsberg to assume the crown, but his home was amongst them. Other provinces might be gained or lost with the chances of war, but while a single Hohenzollern lived, he could not desert his subjects of the mark. They had the intense local patriotism so characteristic of the German nation, which is the surest foundation for political greatness. But while in other parts, the particularists, as the Germans called them, aimed only at independence, the Brandenburger, who had become a Prussian, desired domination. Among them, the Bismarcks lived. The family again divided into two branches, one which became extinct after 1780, dwelling at Krevesse, gave several high officials to the Prussian civil service. The other branch, which continued at Schoenhausen, generally chose a military career. Augustus' son, who had the same name as his father, rebuilt the house which had been entirely destroyed by the Swedes during the 30 Years' War. He held the position of Landrath, that is, he was the head of the administration of the district in which he lived. He married a Fräulein von Goethe of a well-known family, whose estates adjoined those of the Bismarcks. Frau von Bismarck was the aunt of the unfortunate young man who was put to death for helping Frederick the Great in his attempt to escape. His tomb is still to be seen at Wust, which lies across the river a few miles from Schoenhausen. And at the new house, which arose at the Schoenhausen and still stands, the arms of the Cates are joined in the Bismarck trefoil. The successor of the estates, August Friedrich, was a thorough soldier. He married a Fräulein von Debwitz and acquired fresh estates in Pomerania, where he generally lived. He rose to the rank of colonel and fell fighting against the Austrians at Chotusitz in 1742. Ein ganzer Kerl, a fine fellow, said the king, as he stood by the dying officer. His son, Karl Alexander, succeeded to Schoenhausen. The next generation kept up the military traditions of the family. Of 4 brothers, all but one became professional officers and fought against France in the wars of liberation. One fell at Machern in 1813. Another rose to the rank of lieutenant general. The third also fought in the war. His son, the later Count Bismarck Bohlin, was wounded at Grossbeeren, and the father at once came to take his place during his convalescence. In order that the Prussian army might not have fewer Bismarcks, when the young Otto was born 2 years later, he would often hear of the adventures of his 3 uncles and his cousin in the Great War. The latter, Bismarck Bohlin, rose to very high honors and was to die when over 80 years of age, after he had witnessed the next great war with France. It is a curious instance of the divisions of Germany in those days that there were Bismarcks fighting on the French side throughout the war. One branch of the family had settled in South Germany. The head of it, Friedrich Wilhelm, had taken service in the Württemberg army. He had become a celebrated leader of cavalry and was passionately devoted to Napoleon. He served with distinction in the Russian campaign and was eventually taken prisoner by the Germans in the Battle of Leipzig. The youngest of the four brothers, Karl Wilhelm Friedrich von Bismarck, had retired from the army at an early age. He was a quiet, kindly man of domestic tastes. On the division of the estates, Schönhausen fell to his lot, and he settled down there to a quiet country life. He took a step which must have caused much discussion among all his friends and relations, for he chose as wife not one of his rank, not a Kleist, or a Kate, or a Bredau, or a Arnim, or a Elvin Sleben, or any other of the neighboring nobility. He married a simple Fraulein Mintgen. She was, however, of no undistinguished origin. Her father, the son of a professor at the University of Leipzig, had entered the Prussian civil service. There he had risen to the rank and had been cabinet secretary to both Frederick William II and Frederick III. He was a man of high character and of considerable ability, as was not uncommon among the officials of those days. He was strongly affected by the liberal and even revolutionary doctrines of France. Fraulein Minken, who was married at the age of 16, was a clever and ambitious woman. From her son inherited his intellect. From his father he derived what the Germans call Gemüt, geniality, kindliness, humor. By his two parents he was thus connected with the double foundation on which Prussia had been built. On his father's side he had sprung from the fighting nobles. On his mother's, from the scholars and officials. In later life we shall find that while his prejudices and affections are all enlisted on the side of the noble, the keen and critical intellect he had inherited from his mother enabled him to overcome the prejudices of his order. A photo of Louise von Wilhelmine Bismarck, who was Bismarck's mother. The early life of the young pair was not altogether fortunate. Several children died at a very early age. The defeat of Prussia brought foreign occupation. Schönhausen was seized by French troops. The marks of their sword are still to be seen in a beam over one of the doors. The Rittmeister von Bismarck had to take his wife away into the woods in order to escape their violence. Of all the children of the marriage, only 3 lived: Bernhard, who was born in 1810, Otto, and one sister, Malvina, born in 1827. The early life of the young pair was not altogether fortunate. Several children died at a very early age. The defeat of Prussia brought foreign occupation. Schönhausen was seized by French troopers. The marks of their swords are still to be seen in a beam over one of the doors. The Rittmeister von Bismarck had to take his wife away into the woods in order to escape their violence. Of all the children of the marriage, only 3 lived: Bernhard, who was born in 1810, Otto, and one sister, Malvina, born in 1827. Otto did not live at Schönhausen long. When he was only a year old, his father moved to Pomerania and settled on the estates Niefhof and Kutz, which had come into the family on his grandfather's marriage. Pomerania was at that time a favorite residence among the Prussian nobility. The country was better wooded than the Mark, and game was plentiful. The rich meadows, the wide heaths, and forests were more attractive than the heavy corn lands and the sandy waste of the Oder province. Here, in the deep seclusion of country life, the boy passed his first years. It was far removed from the bustle and turmoil of civilization. Nalgard, the nearest town, was 5 miles distant. Communication was bad, for it was not till after 1815 that the Prussian government began to construct high roads. In this distant province, life went on as in the olden days, little altered by the changes which had transformed the state. The greater portion of the land belonged to large proprietors. The noble, as in old days, was still all-powerful on his own estate. In his hands was the administration of the law, and it was at his manorial court that men had to seek for justice, a court where justice was dealt not in the name of the king, but of the lord of the manor. He lived among his people, and generally he farmed his own lands. There was little of the luxury of an English country house, or the refinement of the French noblesse. He would be up at daybreak to superintend the work in the fields, his wife and daughters, that of the household, talking to the peasants the pleasant Plat Deutsch of the countryside. Then there would be long rides or drives to the neighbors' houses, shooting, for there was plenty of deer and hares, and occasionally in the winter a visit to Berlin. Farther away, few of them went. Most of the country gentlemen had been to Paris, but only as conquerors at the end of the war. They were little disturbed by modern political theories, but were contented, as in old days, to be governed by the king. It was a religious society. Among the peasants and the nobles, if not among the clergy, there still lingered something of the simple but profound faith in German Protestantism. They were scarcely touched by the rationalism of the 18th or by the liberalism of the 19th century. There was little pomp and ceremony of worship in the village church, but the natural periods of human life, birth, marriage, death, called for the blessing of the church, and once or twice a year came the solemn confession and the sacrament. A miniature of Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand von Bismarck, this is Bismarck's father, dressed in military regalia with an 8-pointed cross upon his left lapel, or his left breast. He does have a lapel pin as well, and this is a double-breasted, probably 4 or 6 button suit jacket that he's wearing. He may be a bit more beautiful than his son. Religious belief and political faith were closely joined, for the church was but a department of the state. The king was chief bishop, as he was general of the army, and the sanctity of the church was transferred to the crown. To the nobles and peasants, criticism of or opposition to the king had in it something of sacrilege. The words, "by the grace of God," added to the royal title, were more than an empty phrase. Society was still organized on the old patriarchal basis. At the bottom was the peasant. Above him was the gnädige Herr. Above him unser aller gnädigste Herr, the king who lived in Berlin, and above him the Herr Gott in heaven. To the inhabitants of South Germany and the men of the towns, these nobles of further Pomerania, the Junker, as they were called, with their feudal life, their medieval beliefs, their simple monarchism, were the incarnation of political folly. To them, liberalism seemed another form of atheism. But in this solitude and fresh air of the great plain was reared a race of men who would always be ready, as their fathers had been, to draw their sword and go out to conquer new provinces for their king to govern. End of chapter 1.